Nick, thank you very much for, first of all, being here with us. You have this gift of being able to both bring out the best in an audience, but always also bring a sense of incisiveness to these discussions. Your introduction just now could not have been better. I think this Sustainable Innovation Forum is something quite remarkable because year after year it has drawn more and more participants from essentially the world that is at the center of reinventing our economies in the 21st century. And I literally want to spend a few minutes sketching out why I believe this is not just hypothesis, this is not theory, but what are the early indicators of these fundamental shifts that are occurring. But before I do so, let me also recognize Henley Media and Nick, who is standing behind the pillar. I'm not sure if that's the safest place to be, Nick. But Nick Henry, Claire Poole, and all their colleagues who have worked so diligently in making this forum possible and bringing such an extraordinary lineup of speakers here. Let me also recognize BMW. I just had the pleasure with Mr. Schwarzenbauer to speak a little bit about this notion of sustainable mobility. I personally am using one of the BMW i3s during my stay here in Paris. Thank you also for being a sponsor to this event as much as also Climate Tracker and others all on the list have made this event possible. It's interesting that sometimes in the United Nations, you know, we are accused of creating very complex language. So when I was referring to my i3 as a car, I was told, no, that's a very out-of-fashion term. It's now sustainable emission-free mobility. So it's good to see the private sector also picking up on the United Nations agenda and our guide to plain English. We are trying to find a language that gives expression to something very fundamental that is changing. Let me offer a couple of outlooks just at the outset. By the year 2050, electricity generating industries will no longer be charging for electricity. They will simply be trying to recover the return on capital expenditure. This is literally an energy revolution that is unfolding. Many still think this is theory in the sense of the scalability, but as many of you know, in less than 10 years, we have moved from renewable energy technologies being very marginal in the center stage of the economy to last year accounting for almost 50% of new electricity generating infrastructure worldwide, almost half. It took less than a decade for solar, wind, and geothermal to literally arrive in the center stage, not only of developed economies, but actually of developing economies. And I hope that the Minister of Morocco, who will join us here this morning, will be able to speak to the very bold approach that also nations in Africa, because it was on the African continent that this approach perhaps took longer to drive its roots down, but it's now happening. From Morocco to Kenya, where UNEP is headquartered, half of Kenya's electricity is today being generated by geothermal power. This is an investment strategy that followed a green energy policy that Kenya established 8 years ago and has given rise not only to a massive investment in geothermal, but also now to the largest wind power farm on the African continent being built. You can go to Ethiopia, where 120 megawatt wind farms are now being constructed in 27 months by partnerships with international companies from Europe, China, the United States. This is just one illustration of why when we meet here at the Sustainable Innovation Forum, we're not just talking about things in laboratories, we are talking already about technologies that are available in the marketplace, that yes, sometimes face a cost curve, and we were just talking about the challenge of moving from the opportunity of sustainable electric mobility, emission-free mobility, to making it a mass market product. Well, some of us were not even around when people on motorways were driving with cell phones the size of a brick and held them very prominently on the windows so everybody else could see that this was a very expensive tool that only very few people could afford. Today, you can buy cell phones for $15, $20. Some of them you even get for free. The power generating costs for solar and wind have in many countries already reached parity with fossil fuel, and soon they will simply be a kilowatt per hour charge that will disrupt the entire energy industry in terms of how it can actually operate. because the cost of investment is moving away from an ever larger, concentrated, scaled infrastructure to a decentralized infrastructure. New business models are needed. And I will just give you one last example from this area of renewable energy. If you come to Kenya today, you may have heard of M-Pesa, which is the cellular phone-based or smartphone-based transfer of fund infrastructure that was built up by a cell phone operator in Kenya. Highly successful. Now we have a business model where that operator, Safaricom, has joined with a solar panel operator to overcome two problems. One is investors don't want to install individual solar panels in villages. So they're looking for an opportunity to put money down to buy 10,000 panels, to give you a number, and then to hand it over to somebody who will actually install and manage these. The new business model that has emerged with M-Kopa, as it is called in Kenya now, is that these investors install it. The management company uses the special software model it has developed and the infrastructure of the cell phone operator across the country to enable the poorest households in the country to literally pay as you go for the electricity they can afford that evening in their home. Over 300 households have been connected in the first 2 years. The model has been franchised already to Tanzania, to Ghana. It's just one illustration of how suddenly renewable energy technology is not only a technology breakthrough, it is actually creating for a continent like Africa an access to energy pathway that was simply not there up to now. And if you realize that Africa today has 1 billion people as a market, of whom 600 to 700 million do not yet have access to electricity as we sit here today in Paris, and that by 2050, only 40 years from now, 35 years from now, there will be another billion African citizens, i.e. 2 billion Africans looking for access to energy, mobility, food security, you realize that both the necessity to act, i.e. the innovation part and the sustainability part, will become drivers of this future market. Let me take you into another completely different spectrum, the finance sector. I will make another prediction. I believe that over the next 10 years, the world's financial system will be significantly changed, not by the traditional centers of financial transaction in the context of the transatlantic, New York, London stock exchanges, etc., but actually by a rethinking of how financial systems will work happening in China. The People's Bank of China last year commissioned a study group, a set of study groups inside China to review the scope for green financing, because by China's own estimates, in the next 5-year plan period, which commences next year, China will require 300 billion, not million, billion US dollars per annum in green finance to implement the kind of transformation of its industry, infrastructure, and war on pollution that it is undertaking. By its own estimates, maybe 15 to 20% of those 300 billion will actually come from public finance, which is why China has now initiated one of the most systematic and ambitious efforts to rethink how financial and capital markets can be incentivized to accelerate and scale up their green finance capacity. It is of such central importance that, in fact, China, in taking over the presidency of the G20 just a few weeks ago in Istanbul, persuaded the entire G20 that for the first time in 4 years, a new study stream has opened up in the financial track of the G20 to undertake a study on green finance, led by China. Part of that work echoes to work that we have done, and I will simply advise you, if you're interested in how this notion of financial and capital markets shifting and how that financial sector will also influence the transition towards a green economy, a more sustainable economy, a low-carbon economy, then please take a look at a report that we have called The Inquiry. It is a 2-year effort undertaken by UNEP to study how countries have used central banks and financial regulatory authorities to experiment with how to scale up green financing in the economy. We are in Paris just to triangulate this and validate it perhaps further. If we look at the financial sector today, it has been relatively reluctant and slow into moving into this green finance market. Many reasons for that. Many of you are familiar with this. But what has been very interesting for us is, as we worked together with some pension funds and some leaders in the finance and insurance sector over the last year, we set out to establish a portfolio decarbonization coalition, simply inviting those who are in charge of funds, be they institutional investors, pension funds, to look carefully at whether they would be willing to say that we are part of that effort of making at least our portfolio less dependent on fossil fuel investments and by extension to enhance the capacity to invest in a low-carbon economic future. Our hope was to perhaps mobilize $10 to $20 billion in terms of financial investment volume somewhere by the middle of this year, and perhaps to reach $100 billion in terms of commitments by the time of the Paris conference here. Extraordinary things have happened. We already surpassed the $270 billion commitment a few weeks ago, and I would not be surprised if it will be 300 or maybe even 350 by the end of this year. $350 billion of investment capital that is now committed to decarbonize its portfolio, essentially moving out of a fossil fuel intense investment. These are a couple of the indicators of why, when we stand here, or rather sit in the bowels of the Stade de France and talk about sustainability and innovation, we are not simply projecting some theoretical trends or developments into the future. We are actually looking at a global economy that is shifting so quickly, whether in the energy sector, whether in the finance sector, or indeed in the mobility sector. We have so many vehicles on the roads now, and anybody who came by car this morning to the Stade de France will have noticed that the notion of mobility is just about the exact opposite of what we find in our cities today. The ability of people to move and goods to move and to use our transport system as an enhanced form of efficiency in our economy is increasingly being lost, not only because of the way that our traffic systems work, but also because of the pollution footprint. Again, to give you a small example, when we talk about sustainable, low-carbon or emissions-free mobility, we have the front lines of the global automotive sector, BMW, Tesla, Nissan, and others who are now moving very quickly into this market. And we're also seeing the uptake of that upper end of the mobility market being very quick, such as in a country like Norway. Simply through a fiscal policy correction, 20% or more of Norway's newly registered vehicles last year were electric vehicles. People said, impossible. No, consumers will respond to the right signals. But again, back to the continent of Africa. Motorcycles, very cheap motorcycles from China, from India, from Indonesia, are flooding Africa's economy. Fantastic for the citizens of Africa in terms of cheap mobility. Disastrous in terms of both accidents, but more importantly over time, pollution. A two-stroke motorcycle engine today emits 3 to 4 times more than a modern truck in terms of emissions. Again, we are now trying to forge a partnership between Chinese manufacturers and Indonesian manufacturers, because electric motorcycles are available already in the Asian market for exactly the same price. So could we convince African nations to leapfrog an entire generation, establish the electric charging infrastructure in the cities, and persuade China, Indonesia, India to co-invest in Africa's ability to simply phase out two-stroke engines in a matter of years in the urban settings, having enormous impact in terms of health benefits, mobility, and so on. These are literally market-changing opportunities that are emerging today, and these opportunities depend, in the end, on you as private sector, both entrepreneurs, visionaries, sometimes also taking bold decisions early on when neither market nor public policy are ideally aligned. Our role in the United Nations, our work that is happening also in Le Bourget in terms of the COP, is to reduce the inefficiency and the also slowness, the unbearable slowness sometimes of aligning these universes of public policy, of technology, and of the private sector. And I hope that in the discussions here this morning, we can not only focus on these individual examples, but to draw some of the lessons that if you want to have a different kind of mobility infrastructure and technology to succeed, then governments have as much of a role to play in enabling that, or to correct the distortions in the market, as the private sector has to invest its capital and its ingenuity with a degree of risk-taking that sometimes may not be what traditionally happens. It is also about setting in motion a clear signal, and this is my last comment this morning, that I believe has already become obvious here in Paris. Whatever happens in these negotiations, there is in my mind no longer any doubt that the signal that is now being registered by virtually every country across the planet is that the future of our economies is now set on the low-carbon pathway. It may be slower, it may be faster, but there is no longer a kind of debate as to whether it will happen or whether it will happen in 30 years' time. Over 180 countries have submitted their INDCs before this Paris conference. Many people haven't realized yet the historic significance of this, not only in terms of the climate convention, but actually in terms of the fact that virtually every country on this planet now has a national climate change strategy. 20 years of a convention being caught between developed and developing nations has suddenly, simply from the ground up, changed the entire ballgame. These INDCs cover over 90% of the world's emissions. There is no question now that the signal going into the markets for R&D, for technology development, for public policy, for fiscal policy reform, for our energy systems, transport systems, agriculture, infrastructure, buildings, efficiency, are all going to be measured increasingly by how they respond to this low-carbon signal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why a forum like this is not just a glimpse of the future, it is actually bringing the future right into the present, where many decisions will be taken over the next year or two in corporate boardrooms, in prime ministers' offices, that will either position economies, companies, products in the right way, or may miss extraordinary opportunities. On behalf of UNEP, once again, thank you that you have all joined us here today, and I hope you will have a wonderful forum. Thank you.
Achim, just before you hand over the microphone to Madame Haïté, what is the mood that you're detecting at Le Bourget at the moment? And use one of those mics. It's the green mic.
Look, the next couple of days, and I'm sure the Minister will have her own way of describing that as well, is still going to be painful. And we are trying to construct, in the context of climate change, a new kind of order and also consortium of nations. And I think there are feelings of frustration and disappointment because some things that people consider to be fundamental principles of international cooperation are not being taken as seriously. On the other hand, there are also change realities. My sense is by the end of this week, we will come out of Paris with an agreement that if you are a perfectionist, you will always have to criticize because it will not be ambitious enough, it will not be specific enough, it may not be legal enough. But quite frankly, I think it is in perfection that we find the enemy of the good. Very true proverb. This outcome in Paris, I think, is already beyond the point of return or no return from the simple perspective that it marks a turning point in how nations will take climate change issues forward. And again, I refer to the INDCs. Never in the history of our efforts of trying to mobilize efforts on climate change have we had virtually universal commitment to acting at national level and thereby also being able to act collectively at the international level. And the investment figures I mentioned just now are the early indicators that that is also how the markets are reading it.